We think of historians, we historians, are thought of, I think, by the rest of the world as working on empirical evidence. You know, we're fact grubbers, really. And there's always some wise soul who'll remind us that if you do oral history, you've got to be careful because memory is so unreliable. But you've done lots of work on memory. Why would you go in search of memory if it's so unreliable?
Well, thank you for that, Michael. Memory and history are inextricably linked. Some people say history is memory. That's what history is. There's no distinction between memory and history. That a memory is by definition a past, and history is by definition intrinsically about the past, present and future. So I guess let's talk about the terms history and memory and how interlinked they are. But in terms of the sources for memory, oral history is the most immediate and most compelling material that a historian will look at. And of course, it's unreliable, but every source is unreliable in that sense. It's contested, it's problematic, it's to be questioned. So I guess the proponents and supporters of oral history would say oral history provides you with a story about the past that cannot be accessed anywhere else except through somebody's memory.
So you're saying it's not a second best?
Absolutely not. What would you put as first best if that was second best?
That's right.
I mean, we're not looking at a hierarchy, I don't think. I think you have to look at what sort of sources are available and apply a critical analysis of all of them. Now, oral history comes with its particular type of problematic, and you have to be critical of it, like every source. But it comes with its gems, and I think we'll hear today a little bit about what oral history can provide.
Here are some specifics. I mean, tell us about the kind of work you've done, because a lot of people won't know.
Well, my work has looked at particularly the impact of World War I and World War II on families and communities, individuals and groups of people. So I've been interested in looking at the short and long-term impact of war, particularly through trauma and how people have processed trauma and understood their wartime experience. I'm also interested in intergenerational trauma and how second, third generations internalise, process, deal with the trauma of their parents or grandparents. So that sort of work has particularly been, I've been particularly interested in that in relation to that work.
So that you're interested in the way in which not the sins of the fathers, but the suffering of the fathers and the mothers are visited on the generations and the next generation.
I'd be a bit more scientific than that, Michael.
Yeah.
I think trauma is a particular word that will come up, I think, today, and it's the impact that those sort of experiences have on how people relate to their children, how they relate to their families, how they define themselves. And also part of this is forgetting, of course, and it's repressing memory as well. And one of the things historians have found when they've interviewed people about war, any sort of war, World War, Civil War, is often the urge to forget and how that can work in a family narrative, the forgetting as well as the remembering. And a lot of people talk about the silence in their families around wartime experience. That's become quite a big sort of...
Gosh, we've got very dark very quickly, but let's follow that trail. I mean, Sue, let's throw this across to you. Now, for the past year and a half, you've been one of the commissioners on the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, and the object of a Royal Commission is to learn from the past, I guess. I'm imagining that you sit there, you and the other commissioners, hearing some pretty traumatic accounts, trauma laid bare, I guess.
Yes, and more so at the very early stages when we went out into communities. So within about 3 weeks of the fires, we were in, first of all, Myrtleford, then Flowerdale, and then all of the most dramatically fire-affected communities. And in some cases, the earth was literally still smoking, and the evidence of the impact of the fires was all around people. And people reacted in a number of ways. I have a strong memory of a person at the Flowerdale pub, because we were often in pubs, or there were so few facilities left where we could meet with people. And this man of probably in his 30s stood up, and he was in a emergency tabard, and he started talking. and he looked into the middle distance, and he had one arm that he started swinging, and he just seemed to be living the nightmare. He gave the most precise and detailed accounts of how the fire had unfolded for him, and that was with a single prompt. And 20 minutes later, someone actually intervened to, get him to draw breath a bit. So that's one example. The other example that we saw often in the formal hearing room, and maybe months later, people would come in and they'd talk about their experiences in the fire, and not dissimilar to what you're describing, Joy, they'd talk about a complete loss of any sense of time. Often they'd even have a loss of hearing. So a lot of people talked about the roar of the fire, but there were also people who simply couldn't remember any of that. They were so focused on dealing with the present that they can remember what they did, but often they'll say, well, in fact, I looked at my watch and 4 hours had gone, and it felt like 4 minutes. So there's a lot of, I think, just the need to deal with the immediate and the pressure of all of that just put people into a compressed mental state almost.
And as time passed, did people assume a different relationship with their memories? Did their memories shift, change, clarify themselves?
I'm going to say yes and no to that, because each day in our formal hearings we had at 2 o'clock we had a person who was called a lay witness to distinguish that evidence from either an expert or an official evidence. So it's usually a community member or whatever. Now, people did seem to be able to distance themselves from the event, to reflect on it as time passed. So that the longer it was from the event, those lay witnesses were less prone to break down and cry. The immediacy of the event had passed a bit. But also, we had a mini coronial investigation into each of the 173 deaths. And we did that in a smaller room, and we invited the family to come along, and we tried to minimise the distress for families in what was clearly they were about to hear the last hours of the person that they loved. So that's clearly, whatever way you do it, is going to be distressing. And in that instance, the memory was, I suppose it was prompted by hearsay evidence, but the memory was quite acute. And I suppose that because you're getting to the final hours of someone you loved, you had a very acute, in almost every case, a very acute memory of that.
Mm. And were there occasions when people rethought their evidence and wanted to change details?
Well, it's not uncommon for witnesses to do that. They'd come in and they'd say, now, and they're invited to do so. So after they're sworn, they swear an oath, or they then make an acclamation, and then they're invited to either affirm their evidence or make a change. And I suspect, if I'm guessing, probably 1 in 3 people would, on balance, say, look, it was often a trivial thing, a time or something of that sort, but it was clear to people that, having taken an oath, they wanted their record to be accurate.
Mm. Now, I suppose the other way in which people save memories or lose memories when there's a fire is in the form of mementos. Did people actually prepare for fire by planning to save the memories that are precious to them? Or did people talk about the tragedy of losing memories that were precious to them?
Well, again, both. Many people who've got a fire plan, part of the fire plan is, apart from all of the preparation around the house and having suitable clothes to wear and so on, they'll have a box near the door that has all of their photos, their important documents, maybe the hard drive from the computer, so effectively their memories, and then they can get that out to a car quickly if they are leaving their delay until the last minute. But of course then there are the people who weren't prepared and did lose everything, and that was often when they spoke about the loss, it was the loss of the memory. And not only for individuals, but for example, there were people involved in the Marysville Historical Society, and they were terribly distressed at the loss of community memory as well as individual memory.
Mm. Namely, Can you come in on this? I mean, we've started, as I say, at a very dark place, but we're talking about memory and trauma and well, now to the extent to which that can be collective. Have you got experiences, I mean, especially in the Vietnamese community, I guess, that illuminate this?
I have a bit of trouble thinking about this because, well, part of it is semantic, part of it is how do you define what constitutes memory and what constitutes individual memory versus collective memory. I think one thing that can happen, and I think Joy was alluding to this, is that there can be a kind of purposiveness to how we go about institutionalising, collecting and curating memory. And I think that a large part of that can be very well-intentioned, but it can sometimes be restrictive in terms of the very, very complex and capacious thing that memory is.
Give us an example of what you're talking about.
Sure. I think, you know, when we're thinking about archiving or, you know, keeping memories from the past, often there's a very deliberate intentionality to it. It's done in order to bear witness. We do it in order to preserve testimony. We do it lest we forget. And all of these are very sort of end-oriented processes by which we sort of have an outcome in mind, and we also have a certain kind of attitude in mind when we do it, to make sure that trauma is recognised, to make sure that it doesn't happen again, and that's another conversation altogether. And I think that what happens in cases like that is we can actually put disproportionate emphasis on a particular type of memory and often forget, both sort of institutionally as well as individually, the meat and potatoes of our actual lives, the meat and potatoes of our memories and the strangenesses, the interstices through which memory actually, you know, colours our lives.
Are you talking here about the sorts of traumas, or I suppose victories, that can be enlisted for some kind of heroic narrative or some kind of narrative of shared tragedy? Is that what you're urging us to be cautious of?
Oh, geez, I think we have to be cautious of heaps of things. I mean, one thing to be cautious of, I think, is a confusing of memory that makes a tribe of us, a memory that makes us belong to a certain type of cultural ethos or instantiate a membership in a tribe, versus the type of memory which actually complexions how we live and how our minds and consciousnesses work, which are not necessarily narrative-based. And when you say heroic narrative, I mean, of course there's a narrative in whatever story is being preserved, and a lot of oral histories after particular traumas and wars and historical events will attest to instances of sacrifice and heroism and suffering, etc. But there's also a narrative of us looking back, isn't there? There's a narrative of, well, we kind of know better now, and we're looking back to make sure that there's a hierarchy that in some ways is concretized in the very act of looking back. We look back in order to solidify certain preconceptions that we have. We look back very, very discriminatorily, because when you look back at, you know, time past, you could look at infinite things, and yet we choose to look at very particular things. We choose to look at the accounts of people who have been through things that we regard as being significant or substantial. And so, I mean, the example...
So you feel that there can be kind of hubris, do you, in the writing, in the act of making a history?
I think there's, I mean, whenever you set out to archive anything, there's an act of intentionality, and I think intentionality can very quickly lead to hubris, absolutely. And when we're talking about oral histories before, I mean, it sort of struck me, because I've been doing a lot of oral histories as well, that there seems to be such a substantive, and yet, to me anyway, sort of unacknowledged schism between, if someone were to come up to you and say, okay, I would really want to, you know, record your thoughts about this event or, you know, that thing, that period in history that you've been through, then there's a certain type of attitude that you would bring to the table. You'd be ready in a certain way, and there's a certain type of narrative that you would give, and it's a narrative with a capital letter. You know, it's a narrative that preserves what you think deserves to be preserved, and also what you think the other person wants to hear. And then when you think about the 99.9% of the rest of your life, is that not also, worthy of archival preservation? The conversations you have at a dinner table, with the books that you read.
Let's throw that question back to the professor of history.
Oh no.
The question.
Well, I think the question has to do with a kind of caution about creating memory that somehow stands for a collective body of meaning. Is that right? I mean, that you're saying that the idea that you can write a memory of a collective, and that individuals would then build their own identity, partly at least, out of this idea that I'm part of a group of people that has a shared memory. That's something you want to be cautious of, is it?
I guess I'm being a stickler for something else in terms of, I just think memory is such a dangerous and beautiful creature. In some ways, I think memory is more than and greater than the world, because it also incorporates all of those things that didn't happen, all of those things that shouldn't have happened, all those things that we think happened, and we contort and distort and mutate all of these other things. So memory actually contains all of the seeds of the parallel non-happenings, whereas the world is just what the world is, in a sense. And I don't want to cripple it.
Do you know what we're wrestling with here? It's that we've gone from the notion of individual memories. You interview someone and find out how they remember a war or how they experienced a fire. And the reason you do this, the reason you engage in a Royal Commission or you write a history of the way we remember war, is because you're looking for some kind of collective insight. In the end, you want to know what's the lesson for all of us. You don't just let the individual story stand poignantly for itself. You want it to add up. You don't?
Well, yes and no, Michael. I mean, I think every memory is distinctive. There's no two memories that are the same. There'll be a nuance, won't there?
But it's true. But out of those nuances, doesn't there arise a sense of what was it like for this group of people to go through the war, for this group of people to go through the fire?
That's something different to say then therefore there is a collective memory. That is to say that there's a difference between a different, a range of different memories of the fire or World War One versus a collective memory. Now, there's quite a leap there. A collective memory suggests there's a unified framework around which everybody is in step.
We often talk, though, don't we, about a society as if it can be traumatised as a whole, as if the mass psychology of fascism is the famous example,
Absolutely.
Reich's book of 1933.
And there are societies that we can talk about in that way, but I think we have to be careful to generalise, because each and every one of those memories and experiences are different. But having said that, a collective memory of World War One is something that we can talk about in that way, absolutely. But that's different to... there is a distinction, I think, between that and collecting a range of individual memories and talking about them individually and then making the leap to a collective. Don't you think?
I don't actually, but Margot, Mary, I'm sorry. Can we come to you and bring it down to the personal again, unless you want to reflect on things where this discussion is at this moment?
No, I'm very happy to leave it to the
All
historians.
Now, you've written a memoir. It provides a very frank, very honest insight into the private life of a public figure. This is not called Memories, it's called a memoir. So you've done something to transform your memories, to reinvent memories as memoir. What's that process?
Well, I think the best memoirs are a slice of life with a resonance of meaning for the reader. The best memoirs are about memory. They're mischievous, and some of them can be masterpieces. And I thought, look, I'll go for 2 out of 3. That'll be all right. But I wanted to interrogate some of my memories during this period of public life. I wanted to excavate them, if you like, for meaning, and to draw the meaning that I took from them into meaning that might be relevant to the reader. Because at the back of my mind as I was writing, I kept thinking of a phrase someone gave me: just because it happened to you doesn't mean it's interesting. So So you don't have to be, elected to Parliament. You don't have to be on television or in the media to understand that occasional disconnect between your public self and your private self. So that was a rich vein to explore. I don't think you have to necessarily be a writer or a refugee or a victim of a bushfire to be buffeted by waves of grief and loss. Again, that's terrain that people can relate to very definitely. And I was fascinated by the mechanism of memory, and I explored that in writing the book, about this fierce contestability of different memories of a shared event. And you only have to go to a childhood scene where, brothers and sisters sitting around that same table having that same discussion with their father have fiercely different but passionately held different memories. I was also fascinated by what goes on in the brain about memory, for memory. And I was very lucky last week to hear an eminent professor of neurophysiology who's a world expert in brain plasticity. And he said that of all the faculties of the brain, one of the most cherished is memory. And I agree with that, because memory is about our story, however we polish it and reshape it. So our personal story, it's our family story, our communal story, and we are fierce about either protecting or excavating or remembering that. But there's a very big difference, I discovered, in writing this book, between the event and the experience of remembering the event. So in a way, a memory can be an experience, but it's sort of hallowed or polished by the memory and by the remembering.
And by the act of writing it.
Oh, indeed, that's the next step, isn't it? That's the next step. That is taking it from your memory and translating it into an interesting experience for the reader. And that's, I guess, the creative process. So I think that memoir is, no wonder it's, the best-selling genre, literary genre at the moment, with the exception of books on cooking. So if we had a world without memory, which I think was our topic, the shelves in our bookshops would be stripped of memoir. People are interested in memoir, but the best, I think, like Inga Glendinnin's beautiful, beautiful memoir, Tiger's Eye, or someone like Nabokov's Speak Memory, which is a very famous work. The best memoirs are those that excavate the memories, examine them with great honesty and sometimes courage and pain, and then draw out whatever it might be about that human experience that the reader can relate to.
It is very striking that we've talked about darkness, we've talked about pain, we've talked about trauma. I mean, no one said that memory mapped directly onto those things. We can have sunny and happy memories, of course. But this is an opportunity.
But you can remember the same experience differently, can't you? You can have exactly the same experience that for one person will be a sunny memory. I'll give you a quick example. I describe in the book as a freckled-faced, kid in the Wimmera wheatlands, hanging over the back fence, watching the blazing sun sort of surrender into a taffeta sky of a twilight, just wishing my brothers would nick off so that I could look into this beautiful sunset and gaze into infinity. Now, I write that with fondness, and it evokes the sense of possibility. Someone else could write exactly the same words, indeed replicate the same experience, but it could evoke in them a memory of loneliness, of being alone, of being left, whereas...
Well, you could also reinvent a memory for yourself, a memory that's painful you can actually deal with by telling the story in a different way. And perhaps one of the reasons you write a memoir when you've been through a sad time is a way of controlling a memory and making it endurable, is it, Mary?
Well, I'm not sure that you can't control it. You can't control the memories, and they rise up unbidden. but it's what they teach you. And you asked the question that T.S. Eliot asked, why is it, of all the things we have seen and heard and felt and experienced in a lifetime, that certain images reoccur in our mind? Certain images and experiences and memories come back. Now, is it the memory of a lost loved one in their final awful moments in a bushfire? Is it a memory, like I have, of reading the wrong speech in the Parliament? You know, that's sort of an excoriation. You know, so I don't think you can ever control them, but you can try and understand them. You can draw that meaning. Why is that memory coming up in my mind? Because I was embarrassed, I was ashamed, I was angry, and so I needed to understand that. Can you control the emotional feelings that are painful? Well, I wrote most of the section on losing Jock from my journal. I've always kept, as a trained journalist, I've always kept notebooks and journals, and during that period it was critical for me to try and contain my emotions and get the facts of the treatment or lack of treatment and lack of options. And so I wrote the most extraordinary detail in these notebooks, and it was those journals that gave me an entree into those really painful memories, because, you know, my memory, if you like, if I was asked about that period, would have been of a misted mirror. I could see shapes and white gowns, but I didn't have a lot of detail. But I opened those journals, and there it was in excoriating detail and quite a lot of scientific detail. You know, how many milligrams of aniodrone did the doctors give him when his heart started to race, that sort of thing. And I didn't control it, but it gave me an entree into the emotional strength of that memory. And I think that's the answer to the question that T.S. Eliot posed. What is it about these memories that rise up? The reason they rise up in many cases is because there's a deep emotion attached to them. And there's almost a physical memory. I think it was Proust who spoke about the physical memory. I know Inga Glendinning did. She wrote about swinging on a swing on the beach as a child, and she wrote about it beautifully. I mean, her words are glorious. But she said, it's 60 years since I swung on that swing by the beach above the sea. But all at this moment, I can feel in my heart and my breath and the heat of my body the sense of what I felt 60 years ago.
Let me...
I don't know where that took us, but
no,
anyway.
No, I'll tell you where it took us. As I was listening to you, speaking very generously and candidly there, I was remembering things from my own life. And I was thinking, yes, there's been pain like that for me too, or there are memories I've dealt with in that way too. I was looking for a kind of shared response to memory. So it's not just that I'm interested in, you know, Mary Delahunty, who I know from the telly's memories. It's not just about, you know, the private life of a public person. It's actually, it's much simpler than that. Listening to you talk makes me think about our shared experiences, our shared reactions. And that's what I meant, Joy, when I said, in the end, there is something about the collection of memories of various people that makes you want to synthesise them into some kind of shared whole.
Absolutely. And Mary very eloquently has illuminated that. And it reminded me of an example of a friend of mine who was doing some family history, and he was looking into the case of the suicide of his grandfather, which had been silenced in the family, and he interviewed the 5 children, his father amongst them. All of them claimed they found the body.
Yes.
Oh dear.
Yes.
Each and every one of them swore that they found the body. And it makes you think there's a collective memory of the grandfather and the event, but you dig deeper and there's the nuance and what it means, and they're all at different ages in their lives, and now they've rewritten that experience and on it goes, you know. So there's a dynamism to memory. It's never static.
Well, memory, you know, this this wonderful neurophysiologist. His name was Professor Bliss. What a great name. How could you forget that, you know?
He should have manufactured tablets. They would have sold.
Well, he talks about the way the neurons in our hippocampus work and lay down the sort of memory trace. But of course, we pluck the memories out, don't we, as we go along, because we're constantly working on the rough draft of our own autobiography. You know, it's happening in our mind. You know, we've got the Filodex or the inbox working as we go. And so, you know, maybe those children felt, I should have been the one to find my dad. For all those reasons, of course, that we may know about. But also when people tell the story of finding the dad or losing someone or getting on the boat perhaps, that becomes part of your memory as well. So part of your signposting to your identity is absorbing some of the tales that then become polished and part of the web of your memory.
There's also the threat that other person's memory represents to you. You know, the feeling that out there is someone with whom I shared an experience. I have one account of it, they have another account of it, and in their account of it, I know I look bad. I hope they've forgotten.
I mean, that's where sibling memory gets competitive, doesn't it? That, you know, often siblings will remember an event very differently, like you've described, Mary. But you separated the event from the memory of the event, but can you? Do you think you can separate the two? Aren't they one?
Oh,
the
no.
event can only happen with a memory attached to it of some sort?
I'm of the view now, you know, being one book and I'm an expert, you know how it is.
That's because you're a journalist. I mean,
yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Well, this goes to a story about journalism. I covered the aftermath of the assassination of Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, you know, 100 years ago. And I recall vividly the funeral pyre. I recall vividly the hassle and the chaos of India trying to get passes as journalists to actually get out onto the burial fields. But in analysing that memory, it was about being, you know, the best journalist I could be, to give the most expansive account and to get the facts as correct as possible. But in writing about that experience, that memory in the book, I drew something quite different from it, because clearly I was writing about the effect of death. And so I chose a few of those experiences as an international journalist that focused on death. And one of them was Indira Gandhi's assassination, and later on the assassination of her son. So the remembering of that experience was very different now than it was when I experienced it, and I was drawing different meaning from it, and the meaning was about the difference in the way we approach death and dealing with death in the East as compared to the West.
Susan or Nam, do you want to come in on this?
I was just reminded when you were talking about sense memories. There was a study done recently, I think, which gave a lot of grief to parents and teachers, because these guys, I think neurophysiologists or neurobiologists, did a study, and the result was that the old hoary chestnut of, in order to study, you need to concentrate and immerse yourself for a long time and completely devotedly, you know, to that subject of study, was actually debunked. And people, they found, remembered things, you know, the layers were more deeply set when they were associated with different things. So if you listened to different kinds of music while studying, or went outside and felt, you know, the sunlight on your skin, or moved from different desk in different environment to different environment, you would actually remember those things a lot more effectively, because your body has this way of trying to holistically map all of these things together.
And conversely, if I can just go on, sound and smell, of course, can evoke memories.
Absolutely.
We all know what our favourite perfume can mean, or our lover's favourite perfume can mean. The smell of certain food cooked by your grandmother evokes a whole story, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think this is one of those things where we've been talking around the issue of language, And I think when we talk about memory, we often are referring to linguistic memory or articulated memory. That's why I really enjoyed your reference to the souvenirs that families would keep from a fire. But every memory that we have is so inextricably woven into our other memories, our sense of self, and everything we smell and see and taste and feel and touch. And as such, I mean, they're completely beyond evocation. The language is so poverty-stricken.
But surely that's where the dreams come in.
Dreams as well, don't you reckon? I mean, dreams...
Doesn't it speak to the unconscious then?
Yeah.
And where's the repository of the memories we'd like to forget in your dream world?
Absolutely, yeah. It's subconscious, the dream. And these are the engines that drive so much of who and how we think we are. And yet, when you try to stick something down on paper, it's a very different thing that you're defending or a very different thing that you're championing. It's the articulation of the memory. And when people talk about, are you exploiting or appropriating someone else's memory, it's not the actual memory itself, again, but it's the way in which that memory is expressed and the way in which that memory can be exploited, both commercially and culturally. And I think that's where the real sort of nub and tension is.
It strikes me there might be two kinds of memories here. One is of a memory of an intense sensation, as you say, of perfume or of food or of a smell or of a place, which you might associate with a feeling or with a moment of happiness or of fear or some kind of trauma. But the other memory is the memory that, in a way, Susan, you were talking about, which is the memory of a story. I mean, when you put someone on hold an inquiry, they get up and they tell their story. They don't just give you, well, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps they do just give you a kind of vivid image, but I'm imagining that what they give you is a little narrative.
If they're allowed to. The difficulty in a hearing room is it's led through a barrister, and so you can often get quite a fragmented presentation. But in the community consultations, we said we were there to listen, and that's what we did. We had two extremely experienced facilitators, and they would ask a question, and then people would take off. And if we didn't have large events, if we had fewer than 35, which only happened once or twice, we would put them in a circle, and then it would become interactive, and the dynamism that you're talking about of a person feeding off another one's story, that would emerge as well. So, I think it depends on whether the conversation is heavily mediated or whether it's allowed to be unstructured.
Well, if you let someone go and do their own thing, and you're talking about a traumatic event that you're trying to recover or trying to document, what I'm asking you is, do you find that they tend to tell that as a story?
If they're allowed. And then many of them afterwards talked about the fact that they felt better, and we were explicitly trying to do what we could to contribute to the healing process. And we got quite strong and unsolicited feedback from people who attended as witnesses that in fact it did help. And they felt better after they'd... that particularly, I'm thinking of some grandparents who'd lost grandchildren and their own children, and they needed the community to know. To know how bad it felt and how bad it was. In some cases they wanted to attribute blame, but they had a need just to for their story to become our story. It was very important to them.
Nam, can I ask you whether you experience memory as stories? Do you think that, every day, I guess, do people think, oh, I've just been through a story. This tram ride was a story. It had a beginning, a middle and an end, and then I walked into the building and another story unfolded. Is that what happens? Is it a sequence of stories, or is life just full of sensations that kind of jumble along, and writers actually engage in an act of abstraction, which is to create a story out of a kind of narrative chaos?
I often think, that idea if an alien came down to Earth and tried to figure us out by checking out our photo albums, they would just assume that we were a very happy race. And I feel that way about stories as well. There's a certain type of archival and narrative instinct that we all have, and I think it's very animal. I think it's very deeply bred, because it speaks to that impossible thing of saying, I exist, I'm here, even though you're not going to for very long. And we then tend to privilege certain moments that we think of as being narratively worthy in our lives. And for me, that stuff is interesting. But I guess it's more what you were talking about, and what you were talking about as well, the idea of the involuntary memory, the idea of the image that is just completely charged and you don't know why, the thing that you return to, the faith that you have when you're trying to articulate something like this, that if something is charged for you, then it maybe will be for a reader as well, even though you don't know why. And I think that not knowing why is actually not an impediment, it's actually necessary. Because if we understood the shape and scope of why things just got stuck in the core of our minds, then we wouldn't obsess about them. You know, we wouldn't agitate a whole internal wound about them, and then they wouldn't carry such.
So the
such
story,
weight.
you are a writer of stories. Do the stories come later, do they? Are they an act of artistry? They're an act of invention. They're like laying paint on a canvas.
I've come to a different. I guess when I was first writing, I thought that so much literary fiction, I guess, was too wishy-washy. It was a bit too abstract and too sort of obsessed with its own lyricism. And I was coming from a poetic background, so I was really wishy-washy and, you know, wannabe lyricist. And so at that stage, I was really all about structure. And I thought, you know, we are so bred for stories and narrative. If you put one person in a room, in a story on the page, and then you put another person on the street below them, automatically the reader's mind will spin out a whole range of narrative possibilities, and tensions is what's going to happen. And so I thought, yeah, let's get some really cool stories in, some age-old archetypal stories, some stories that sort of go deep into, you know, what it means to be human. And I guess now I find that there's story in everything, or there's story in nothing, perhaps. I find that a person thinking about something and then rethinking and then being self-aware about their own thinking about that thing, if executed properly, can be extraordinarily riveting and very, very perspicacious. I find that really interesting. I also find a typical revenge story very interesting. You know, I think there's just this sense of causation and this sense of connection, this sense of association, especially when we don't understand it fully, when we don't know why that memory means something to us. I think that's where, at the moment anyway, the real juice of narrative is for me. Mary,
do you find that people experience, or that you personally experience, life as stories? And I ask you that partly because you have this background as a journalist, and I now flirt with journalists, as it were. Well, not actually, but you know, I work with journalists at the ABC. And of course, the question you ask when you're a journalist is, you look at a sequence of events and you say, is this a story? Where's the story here? And in some ways, the act of creating the story is about taking away all the stuff that doesn't fit and then seeing if what's left is going to stand up as a story. And you can sometimes see that as an act of falsification. You know, that's what journalists do. They turn the complexity of life into a kind of neat story. But I suppose my own feeling is that life is full of stories. I actually experience life as stories all the time. So I wonder where you stand on this.
I didn't consciously think about stories until I started writing this, but yes, as a journalist you would ask, or be asked, is it a story, is it a yarn? And the way I was trained was, what is it, where is it, and why? You know, and if you can answer those three questions and make it interesting and comprehensible, that's the job of the journalist, and factual. Although that's becoming vastly overrated these days, as I notice. Someone said to me, the only thing you can believe in the newspaper now is the date and the price. And I thought that was a bit harsh, a little bit harsh. But yes,
Wasn't
I do.
There an extraordinary picture on the front of the Sun today? Did you see that, of Brumby in an army uniform? And then it said underneath, it did say digitally mastered or some phrase like that. But it still seemed astonishing to me that they would put a picture on the front page of the paper of, you know, the Premier in a army uniform that he'd never worn.
No, that's. I think that's a step too far, quite frankly. But as to experiencing life as stories, yes, I think so. I love raconteurs, and I've wondered why, and clearly it's because they tell a good yarn, they tell a good story. And you can hear someone tell the same story in a very dreary way and someone else bring it alive with the gems of the language, the pausation, whatever they use. And so there is always a story in our lives, but most of us don't tend to stop and look at it until we pick up a good book or we're obliged to tell a story for some reason or another. It's one of the great joys of memory, really, isn't it? Because memory is about shared stories in many cases.
Joy, during our shared career, which has been in parallel as historians, we've seen debates about the role of story in history rise and fall. You know, there was a time, when was it? I suppose particularly in the 80s, when narrative was very questioned. It was very dubious. It was a real act of imposition and falsification, that there were more fundamental social forces that could be described and accessed. But story appears to me to be back.
Well, I think certainly it's at the heart of what history is, really, Michael, isn't it? It's a story about the past as it's been reconstructed by somebody in the present. So the story has always been at the heart of it. It's how it's been understood and how it's been structured, different to other mediums, television, media, digital, literary and so on. So it occupies a different sort of terrain, but the narrative and the storytelling, the best history, I think, is still at the heart of it. Yeah.
There's another interesting dimension to that, I think, now, and it's a literary genre, but a novel that is set in a particular historic period and recreates events. I think Wolf Hall, for example, is a great example of that. And even though the reader's comforted by going to the back and seeing all the sources, the primary and secondary sources that have been used, you still know that it's a reconstruction of events as the author sees it. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to muse as to whether that's been led by the fact that we have movies and television, and so we're creating for different genres and we want to bring history alive. I'm thinking also of the movie Victoria and Albert, which brought that period of history alive as well. So that's I think there's a bit of debate amongst historians as to that as a genre as well.
There is. I mean, whether it's reliable, what's driving it, how interpretive it is. Because some people do read them and watch films particularly uncritically. I mean, film is such a compelling medium, isn't it? But that's right. There's a lot of debate within historical circles around how you can recreate the past and how you should. But I'm a great believer in that popular medium. I think it's fantastic because it brings history out to people who might not ordinarily be interested in it necessarily, or younger people or whatever. So I think the more the better. I think it's terrific.
So is it ever better to forget?
Well, I mean, Joy began, I think, by talking about the people who suppress memory from, very traumatic periods in their lives. I can think of one of the people who in fact didn't come to the coronial hearing, who lost his wife and 3 children in the most tragic circumstances, and himself was very injured. And I completely understand why he didn't want to hear that again. He knew it. So I think perhaps, and maybe the question about whether it's ever better to forget also has a time dimension to it as well. Maybe close to an event, it's just too painful to evoke the memory again.
That's not the same as forgetting, though, is it? I mean, I can imagine some therapist saying, well, it'd be better if that person got that out. They're repressing a memory, and goodness knows what will be the implications of that down the track.
Well, another example I can think of is someone who made some very bad decisions on the day and lost a family as a result of it. So I suspect that person would want to forget as well. I mean, that would be an extraordinarily painful memory to live with. So I'm not a therapist, but I can imagine circumstances where the memory is just too traumatic.
Nam, ever better to forget?
I don't know. I mean, it's impossible, right? Because what are you forgetting? Once you know what you're forgetting, you haven't forgotten it. And if you've forgotten it, then what are we talking about?
Nicely played, sir.
No, but sort of following on what we were talking about in terms of yarn spinning and tall tale making, I reckon there's a really strong case to be made for the idea that perhaps history and fact, that relationship should be given a lot more latitude, should be much more elastic than it is. Because if you look, and again, it's a tough thing, because when you look back, the extant material is somewhat limited. But when you look at old historians, when you look at Herodotus or Thucydides or Xenophon, the stuff that really sticks out at you is the narrative stuff, the stuff that there's no way they would have known, there's no way that they've got any sort of means of substantiation, but it's the stuff that sticks with you because it's interesting and it's a story. And in fact, in cultures where oral history is how memory is passed on, the embellishment and distortion and omission and mutation of that memory is an integral part of the memory.
You see, that's a fiction writer's argument.
Yeah, I know.
Now, I should tell you this. I wasn't going to talk about myself, but I'm married to Hanny Rayson, the playwright, and we share an office. We sit back to back. And if I write "It was a dark and stormy night," I then have to come down here to the library, go to the Sydney Morning Herald and check whether it was a dark and stormy night. And she regards this as sort of obsessive. She says, well, it would be good if it was. Just make it a and who cares if it was a dark and stormy night? But of course, you have to be.
We have to, Michael. Ascertain the facts.
It's such a hassle, don't you find?
It's very labour intensive. That's for sure. But we love it, Michael. We love it.
We do love, because you find all these other things in the paper.
While you're there reading in 1890 what the weather was, you can see who was executed or who tripped over what or whatever.
What the price of pork was.
It's marvellous, yes.
It's marvellous, yes. Yes. I think we better have some questions.
No, just before we go.
Oh, yes,
Michael,
no, please, don't let them ask questions.
No. I just wanted to say one tiny little thing, and that was between the dichotomy of remembering and forgetting is silence. And silence, I think, is an interesting category, what Susie's saying actually, because it's not quite forgetting, but respecting silence of people who have had traumatic memory, I think, is really, really vital. And I think the notion of silence is very interesting, and why people remain silent and why their memories are silent. They have a memory, but they are choosing to be silent, I think is a really important part of this conversation.
It also goes to the reason why a minute's silence on a day of sadness is so poignant.
Exactly.
Because actually you can't say what it is you remember. It's too big.
No.
I always think the words "lest we forget" are sort of wonderful and poetic words, but it's too easy to assume that we know what it is we're supposed to remember. You know, what we're supposed to remember, say, of the Somme or of any other war is kind of beyond measure in a way. We're just in the presence of it.